Hello, everybody. Welcome, as always, to this week's Tradeview. Of course, as always, I am your host, Eliman Dambell. And of course, what we are going to be doing this week is previewing some of the markets in which we believe could potentially provide a lot of trading opportunities. Of course, we do know we have a holiday in the US, Thanksgiving, and of course, Black Friday thereafter. But there is a lot happening in the markets, and there are quite a lot of different fundamental announcements in which we can essentially go through to see if we can find any opportunities before we get to the holiday this week. Now, from your own perspective, of course, and I always say this, guys, these sessions aren't here to give advice. These sessions aren't here to give you a general direction as to where the markets essentially will go. If we did have those answers, had that crystal ball, by all means, we wouldn't be in the brokerage industry. We'd probably be executing trades, of course, as fortune tellers. Now, from your own perspective, do take anything we go through on these sessions with a pinch of salt, and just make sure you do your own analysis prior to making any trading decisions. In moving forward, of course, we know there is a lot happening here at Tradeview. We do have the MT4, MT5, C-Trade, and quite a few other platforms. Of course, we are an EC and STP broker. And guys, from your own perspective, what I will say with these sessions, as always, we mainly look at the MT4. But regardless of the platforms in which you do use, absolutely make sure that you do so using as much analysis as possible. Now, speaking of analysis, what we are going to be doing, of course, is moving on to the platform. Before we do so, just to have a very, very brief look at what is going on from a fundamental perspective. Of course, as we speak, we know in the next pretty much hour or so, we have the consumer confidence index coming out there from the US. So that would be an interesting one for those of you trading US related assets. Looking ahead to the rest of the week, you have quite a lot coming out, mainly there in the EU. You have German CPI numbers coming out, GDP numbers, of course, from Switzerland, unemployment numbers, and other CPI numbers from other Eurozone countries as well in the latter part of the week. And of course, we have GDP numbers coming out of Canada. So there is a lot to potentially digest from your own perspective when it comes to you finding some opportunities. But besides those, there are quite a lot of other storylines, and those will be essentially what we cover here today. Now, the first storyline essentially that we must pay attention to is the DAX. We are in a position, and if I just briefly move on to, let's say, a monthly candlestick, you can see we are essentially on the cusp of that all-time high. We are pretty much on the cusp of seeing the DAX reach its all-time high. And the question is, will it reach its all-time high? Would it reach and even potentially break its all-time high? Could we see the opportunity for further longs leading to a new all-time high being set as it pertains to the DAX? Of course, we've seen likewise happen in US indexes, the likes of the S&P and others reaching all-time highs pretty much every other day now. But it's a case of saying, can we see the Europeans follow, and can the Germans essentially put us in a position of seeing a new all-time high? Now, it's a great storyline. If it were to happen, regardless of the situation with Brexit, regardless of the situation with a lot of uncertainty surrounding a lot of Eurozone countries, if we were still to see the DAX outperform all of these tensions, all of these points of uncertainty and reaching all-time high, that would be an absolutely great storyline. But there is a hurdle. There is an obstacle. And that is, of course, in the form of what we see or perceive to be somewhat of a resistance. Of course, if you zoom out and if you look historically, you can see a lot of resistance taking place there at this current level there. And of course, the previous all-time highs, you can see where the sell-offs really started to take place. So there is a lot of not only tension and uncertainty, but there is a lot of bearish activity taking place at this level there. So with the formation of what we perceive to be a ceiling, with essentially the market seeming to be oversold, but of course, if you look clearly or closely, you can see, even though it is still close to, let's say, the 70s, which we know to be oversold or have relative strength, around 65, the question is, where and which direction will the flow of flow of traffic essentially take us? Would we see the flow lead and guide us back towards, let's say, the 77s? And if that does happen, of course, we would be fairly confident that would be enough to reach that all-time high. Or are we going to see a sell-off, essentially creating the opportunity for a downwards move? Now, looking at the moving averages, the potential for a downwards crossover 10-day, 25-day moving average would be absolutely one of the key indicators a lot of traders would be looking at when deciding how to act in this particular market. So absolutely interesting storyline. Will or will not. Yeah, that doesn't make sense. You can tell it's been a long day here in the office, quite a lot happening at Tradeview. But the question we want the answer to is, will the DAX essentially reach its all-time high? If it does, it would be absolutely great. Still some opportunities on the upside. But in the grand scheme of things, the markets are positioning themselves for a potential fall in the long run. Now, moving on to the second market in which we are going to be looking at today. Of course, each and every single week we try to look at 3. This week we may look at 4 if we have time, and hopefully now in looking at Bitcoin, I can articulate myself a bit better than I did there with the DAX. Now, with Bitcoin, as you can see, it has reached essentially the lowest point in which we've seen essentially since April and May. Since April and May, of course, we saw that huge rally which took place pretty much, and I remember I wrote an article about this. The rally took place, the comeback of all comebacks took place around the time where we saw the likes of Liverpool coming back from around, 3-0 down to beat Barcelona, the likes of Tottenham coming back from around 3-0 down to beat Ajax to both reach the Champions League final. Then a few weeks later, of course, the grand comeback of Bitcoin took place with that run there. Since then, we saw a lot of consolidation, now selling off, then further consolidation, and of course, further levels of selling taking place there as well. You can potentially perceive this to be somewhat of a descending triangle, but more in the very short term. The question now is, once the markets have hit this floor, what are we going to see? Are we going to see, let's say, essentially people buying at support? We have seen this take place before. We have seen a lot of selling off, hitting support, and a lot of streaks of buying taking place. Looking at the overall volume, you can see it's clearly oversold. We know 30 and below is the level of of relative weakness, and you can see it has pretty much passed that point. Now, the question is, what is going to happen? Are we going to see the likes of what we saw before, the markets here forming some consolidation, or are we going to see essentially the bulls enter and bring the price back up? It would be interesting to see what happens if and when the markets start to head back towards, let's say, the 31 levels. You can see that's where the buying historically really took place, at least the last time that the markets were in this area. So you could potentially say there is a relative floor. It's a very small floor, but you could still call it a relative floor or ceiling at around 7,500. And of course, if the markets start to look towards the 7,600 areas, is where a lot of bulls could potentially be interested. But again, we still need to remove this short-term descending channel. And if you look at the moving averages essentially signaled a downwards crossover. Both of those have taken place. They're still pointing downwards. So the question here is it actually time for the markets to turn around? Or again, will we see that level of consolidation? Now, we may have time to look at both, but we have to look at gold. Of course, we know consumer confidence numbers coming out fairly shortly in the US, and of course that will have its impact on the price of gold, potentially speaking. Now, gold, what we have seen with the metal, we've seen that range take place there, and it took place essentially for the majority of the summer. The sell-off which took place when we saw the likes of the FOMC report showing us that the US economy was, relatively speaking, in a stable place, and of course October's rate cut wasn't due to any potential fires or putting out of any potential fires by Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve. Now, the market seemed and appeared to, of course, try and breach back into those support and resistance levels in which we, of course, saw in the majority of the summer. But it just wasn't able to, of course, again, mainly due to that news coming out of the Fed. However, as the markets have hit this floor, we have seen a lot of uncertainty. The question is, what exactly is the next direction? Can this floor essentially hold? Can we see another rally similar to what we saw there, bring us back towards those 1500 levels? And if that does take place, could that coincide with a potential upwards crossover of the moving averages? Markets are oversold, so the volumes are there. But again, the question here is, are there enough? And let me use this analogy. Are there enough sacrificial lambs as it pertains to the bulls to put themselves out there in order to gain the confidence of the majority? So are there enough who may go through the interim uncertainty and increase the level of the volume, taking us to levels, let's say, like the 49.50s, where we have seen a lot of buying taking place? And if those initial entrants can bring us to that level, will we see a lot of buying take place, potentially even taking us back to that ceiling of around 15.18? So are there sacrificial lambs there potentially willing to take that early level of risk, so the majority will feel more comfortable entering at a level or at a price point where a lot of buying had historically taken place? So that's an interesting one. Last but not least, this is one I barely look at, but I saw an interesting pattern, and it posed an absolutely interesting question. Firstly, we're just on the brink of a crossover. We probably have just seen an upwards crossover of that 10-day red and 25-day moving average, respectively. We see what happens when those crossovers take place. We're not saying that's going to happen again, absolutely not. But we see it is essentially trading at a resistance. If that moving average crossover can be sustained, if we do see, similar to what we said before with gold, if the buyers essentially push, or the early buyers essentially push the volume over, let's say, that 53, 52 point resistance as it pertains to the RSI, could we see moves like this take place above there, essentially bringing us to those levels there? We have seen the buys there before. And even there. But again, is there enough, and can there be enough volume on the upside to see those runs essentially take place? So a lot of interesting topics, a lot of interesting storylines for this upcoming week. Of course, for those of you in the US celebrating Thanksgiving, hopefully you enjoy the holidays there with your families. But guys, as always, thank you for joining the weekly Trade View. Your host Eliman Dambell here, and look forward to seeing you next week. All the best.